and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu, sitting in for Riz Khan. What lies in store for Egypt and Tunisia after their revolutions, and what impact are those historic events having on other Arab nations? It all started with a slap that was heard around the world. On December 17th, a poor street vendor, Mohamed Bouzizi, set himself on fire in central Tunisia after being slapped by a policewoman. His death triggered angry demonstrations, forcing President Ben Ali to flee the country. Inspired by Tunisia, Egyptians too erupted into massive protests that culminated with President Hosni Mubarak stepping down after 3 decades in power. Now tens of thousands in Algeria, Jordan and Yemen are also demanding political and social reform. So today we ask, how will the Egypt effect be felt across the Arab region? Remember, you can call in with your questions and comments, and of course we also welcome your emails and text messages on the show. We are bringing back the 3 bloggers we had on the show last month, just before the uprising in Egypt. We will ask them about the predictions they made and examine the political future of the Arab world. Joining me now is Sami Ben Garbea, co-founder of the Tunisian website nawat.org, which played a critical role in getting information out of that country during the protests. He's in Tunis. Joining us from Cairo is Egyptian activist Wael Abbas, whose regular tweets from Tahrir Square were followed avidly during the uprising. And with us from Boston is Mauritanian-American Nasser Wadadi from the American Islamic Congress, where he promotes civil rights and social media activism in the Arab world. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you to the show. Wael Abbas, let me start with you. When you were on the show last, that was on January 25th, it does seem such a long time ago, but it was just last month. We asked you if a Tunisia-style revolution was possible in Egypt. Here's what you said at the time. Let's watch.
The problem with Egypt is that it's a bit unlikely that something similar happens to here, because we don't have workers strong syndicates for workers and unions, just like the lawyers syndicate in Tunisia and the syndicate of doctors and the syndicate of people who are working in education. Our government is smart. This regime has been in power for like 60 years.
Well, while change, as we can now see, 2020 vision looking backwards is very clear. Well, we can see now change did come. It came in a very dramatic way in Egypt. At what point do you think, during the protests and demonstrations, did that change become irreversible? What was the tipping point in your view?
I think it was the time when the protesters reached 1 million in Tahrir Square, and I think the day after they dispersed the demonstrators in Tahrir Square by tear gas and rubber bullets, and then they came back on the next day in larger numbers, that it was going to be successful, because people were persistent and they had these demands that they wanted to fulfill, and they were not frightened by security, central security forces and tear gas, and they came back the next day. I felt that this is new. This is something here is going to happen.
Well, we now have a new Egypt, if I could put it that way. It's a transitional period that Egypt is in right now. Now, what do you think it will morph into? Will it morph into a democracy, or is there a danger that it could take the form of another dictatorship in a different form?
Well, it's all in the hands of the army at the moment. I'm very skeptical about the army. I have lots of fears about it, but we still have to be optimistic, and we still have to work on making it a democracy. We cannot let the army do everything. We should monitor, we should watch, and we always should be prepared to go back to Tahrir Square if things go wrong, because Tantawi is the same Tantawi that was under Mubarak. So I don't see much change here, but we have the promise of the army that it's not going to replace democracy that people want, and we are taking the army's word for it, and the whole world was watching when the army gave us this promise. So we'll have to wait and see.
Right, I guess we will know in the weeks and months ahead. Let me bring in Nasser Wadadi. He's in Boston. Nasser, we're seeing demonstrations now in other Middle Eastern countries. We're seeing demonstrations in Yemen, Jordan, Bahrain, and Algeria as well. Do you think these demonstrations will escalate, or is it likely that they'll be crushed there?
I mean, they already escalated in Iran and in Bahrain with people who died yesterday. But I think that Bahrain is actually the most interesting case here because Bahrain is at a strategic crossroad. And the irony here is that seems to be a conspiracy of silence to look the other way regarding Bahrain, because it is the matrix that basically blindsided all the so-called Middle East analysts and geopolitical analysts that couldn't predict what was happening. They're completely blindsided by the events. And the important thing about Bahrain is that you have to remember that Bahrain actually gave the Arab world the one guy who proved years ago that you can take online activism back to the real world, and that's imprisoned blogger Ali Abdel Imam. And I want you to remember that name because this guy has been instrumental in pushing in the creation of the movement that later gave us what we saw. But again, the irony here in Bahrain is that the conspiracy of silence, both in the West and in the Middle East, is that whereas you have the West and its allies in the region and its clients looking suspiciously at Bahrain's majority and basically keeping this myth about Bahraini Shia being somewhat agent of Iran, while Iran is busy itself with its own uprising. And I'm afraid that the Bahraini demands of the majority of the people of Bahrain are being right now whitewashed for geopolitical interest and strategic calculations. And there couldn't be anything more ironic than yesterday, both Bahrainis and Iranis taking to the streets demanding the same thing, which is civil rights. And today, they occupied a square in the middle, in Manama, in the capital, emulating what we saw happening in Tahrir.
Okay.
This is new.
Just let me ask you this. At the outset, you said that there's a conspiracy of silence, that people are looking the other way. Who's looking the other way?
Everyone. The United States, European Union, and by the way, our own Arab leaders and some of our own Arab media outlets, because on the one hand, you have the usual mullah trauma that has subsisted since the Iranian regime took over Iran in 1979. And then you have, for example, Saudi Arabia in particular, Saudi media that has been going on a very aggressive sectarian and frankly racist push demonizing Shia across the Middle East. And at the same time, you have the Bahraini regime capitalizing on the fears in the West, and particularly in the United States. We know for a fact that they have their lobbyists lobbying very aggressively right now on Congress to perpetrate this myth about Bahraini Shia being somewhat connected to the Iranian government. As a matter of fact, it is, if anything, it is the repression of the Al Khalifa monarchy, a despotic monarchy that has escalated the situation in Bahrain. It's not the people who are demanding to be treated as equal citizens. And one of their chief demands, interestingly, which is the other big taboo in the Middle East and North Africa, they are importing settlers. Just like other countries in the region, they're bringing Sunnis to put them in the security forces and in the military to ensure that they lock down the system, and in the hopes of changing the demographic formula in Bahrain.
All right, let's go to Sami Ben Garbia. He's in Tunis. Sami, so much has changed so fast in Tunisia. One commentator described it as change at dizzying speed. And for you, you must experience this in a very personal way because you left Tunisia, you fled, and you've returned now to your country after 13 years in exile. So what does it feel like?
Oh, happiness. I'm very happy to be here after these 13 years of exile, but also I'm very happy to get in touch again with reality and try to follow what was happened during the last years, especially during the last month of the revolution, but also what's going on now in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Jordan, in Libya, in Algeria. Keep us busy, try to support and be to build a strong solidarity with the reform movement across the Middle East. But the lesson from Tunisia that I hope the Egyptian revolutionary will learn is that nothing is granted. I mean, they need to protect the revolution. In Tunisia, unfortunately, we didn't celebrate the revolution the way they celebrated it in Egypt in the Tahrir Square. I mean, directly after Ben Ali fled the country, the snipers mechanism started killing people on the street, and the chaos around the country prevented people from celebrating the revolution. And now there is what we call regional committees in each part of the Tunisian country trying to protect this revolution from being hijacked by the Ben Ali guards, who few of them are in this government, which is being perceived by some political activists and by a lot of grassroots activists as a non-legal and non-representative of the Tunisian revolution. So my voice to the Egyptian people is just be aware that no one can hijack the revolution that was the fruit of the sacrifices of the Egyptian people.
Well, how do you see events unfolding in the weeks and months ahead?
You mean in Tunisia?
In Tunisia, yes,
across
in Tunisia,
the Middle East?
yeah, in Tunisia.
In Tunisia, I'm from the city of Bizerte, and I am getting part of what we call a regional committee to protect the revolution. I mean, what we've seen now is that the government is appointing some mayors in different cities, but there is a mechanism in the street that is rejecting those mayors. Those mayors are being perceived of part of the old ruling party, the RCD, and they are simply rejecting them and pushing the government to replace them with other people who are much more credible, and they are not like complicit with the old regime here. So there is two mechanisms in Tunisia. There is two dynamics. The dynamic of the street, which is very revolutionary, trying to keep on the struggle to make the revolution go through the system. And you have the mechanism of the state, the mechanism of the old regime, and the mechanism of some of the opposition party who try to collaborate with the establishment on the expense of those who have been killed in the street. Those two mechanisms are very, very strong.
Right.
Unfortunately, what we are seeing now, yes.
Okay. Yeah, you know, you talk about protecting the revolution, but in your view, what are the major challenges that Tunisia faces right now? I mean, it's going to be very difficult to reverse all these years of nepotism and corruption in the country. So what would you like to see in the short term?
What we like to see, especially on the media scene, I mean, Tunisia, we have the national television, we have the national radio, who are completely disconnected from what is going on in Sidi Bouzid, in Gasrin, in Tala, in the south, in the northeast, and even in the extreme north in Bizerte. What we've seen now is that the debate are being dominated by a few figures who are articulating a kind of debate based on some pragmatic analysis to protect the Tunisian establishment and give it some time just to fight against the chaos and prepare the step to the next election. But for the other part of the Tunisia, the second mechanism, the second dynamic, the dynamic of the street, is that this media is not representative of the Tunisian people. I mean, only few people in Tunis, the capital, are present on the scene talking about issues that are not representative in Tala and Gasrin and Bizerte and Sidi Bouzid and El Kef, etc. What we are trying now is to have an alternative media on the ground that represents the people and bring the voices of those marginalized communities that were not represented during the Ben Ali regime, and for sure they are not represented now. So for us, for me personally, the struggle is a media struggle, and it's the same as under Ben Ali, is an anti-propaganda struggle.
Okay, Sami, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Sami Ben Garbia for joining us. He was joining us from Tunis. We will be following developments in Tunisia very closely. But now let me, joining us from Amman is the Jordanian political commentator and observer Nassim Taroneh, who blogs at Black Iris. That's black-iris.com. Nassim, thanks for joining us. In this part of the show, I want to ask you, the Jordanian foreign minister was interviewed by a United States network yesterday, by the Fox News network. And speaking on that network, the foreign minister, Nasser Judah, said that the demonstrations and protests in Jordan will not affect the country. He was referring, of course, to Jordan. Is that right?
I think we have to determine and differentiate what he means by affect the country. I think protests have been affecting the country, whether the government is aware of it or not. Egypt has changed realities on the ground throughout the whole Arab world. And protests here, especially those held during January, did affect the country. People came out to express their concerns. It was a diverse group of people, from Islamist opposition to tribal leaders. So there is an obvious effect on the country. There is a mood that is sweeping not just Jordan but throughout the Arab region. So there is an obvious effect.
Well, there's obviously also a very big disconnect between those who rule Jordan and those who are being ruled, because in that very same interview, the minister said that Jordan is a vibrant, dynamic, democratic society. Those are his words. What do you make of that?
I think democracy is a little far off in Jordan. We have an appointed government and an appointed Senate. The only real body that is elected by the people is the lower house of parliament, which few people in Jordan give a great deal of legitimacy or credibility to. So I think, socially speaking, people are interacting in different ways, in unique ways that are democratic by some definition, but as a system, I think we're a little far off from calling it a democracy.
Okay, let's go back to Nasser Wadadi. He's in Boston. Nasser, there is something that we often hear from Western nations, that inherent in all this change that is taking place in the Middle East is a danger that radical Islamists will take over. Is that a valid concern for countries like the United States, for countries in the European Union?
Again, it's the mullah trauma in action again. That's not to say that Islamist movements are not in the ground and that they're real. But I think the Western decision makers, for all sorts of complicated dynamics, actually don't realize that this notion that it's either the dictatorships or the Islamists is a notion that they were fed by their own dear allies. Hosni Mubarak, king of Saudi Arabia, king of Jordan. They made an industry of this notion in the last 2 decades after what happened in Algeria, the events of 1992, where basically the West gave the Algerian generals a green light to go on and repress an otherwise fair election that ended up costing 250,000 dead. And I think that the concern is somewhat legitimate, because again, the Western decision makers, as much as the Arab leaders, are still stuck in that 20th century matrix, which is there is a wink-wink agreement between everyone. Just do elections, and as long as they're transparent, that's fine. We'll look the other way when we accept that as a democracy. But the news we all know, North Korea has the elections, China has elections. That means nothing. What is lacking, and that's has been the call of all the protests that we've seen, from Tehran going on to the Atlantic Ocean, what they're talking about is madaniya, civil. They're talking about civil rights, because the people of the Middle East learned in the last 50 years that elections per se are meaningless if there aren't any institutions that will guarantee individual rights. And what I mean by individual rights, this is the notion that everyone is tiptoeing about it, is that let's say that a Muslim Egyptian decides to convert to some other religion. Let's say decide that a woman decides that she wants to run for, let's say, a prime minister in Jordan, even though that the analogy is imperfect. What they want and what we would like to see, and that's the ultimate guarantee of a real democracy, is institutions that allow things like that to happen without fear of being persecuted. And that's something that neither the Islamists nor the sitting regimes are being capable to produce or even willing to produce.
Okay, let's go to Wael Abbas, who is in Cairo. Well, the military in Egypt, they're now in charge, but they have not cancelled the emergency laws. They've not freed those who've been arrested during those 3 weeks of demonstrations, nor indeed any political prisoners. Doesn't that sound a little bit ominous to you? And shouldn't that be the first step that the military should be taking? Or steps, I should say.
Yeah, indeed. This is what we are discussing on the internet at the moment, that they haven't lifted the state of emergency yet, and they haven't released prisoners. And actually, there are some reports that the people who were detained by the army in the days during the uprising were tortured. We have pictures of people who have been lashed or electrocuted, and reports of people who have been waterboarded. This is not acceptable at all from the army. And also what makes me worried is that the army is now the one that is forming this constitutional committee that is supposed to amend the constitution or to start a new constitution altogether. And they have appointed a judge who is known to be an Islamist. Yes, he's a moderate Islamist, but he's an Islamist after all, and this is not what we were looking for. We were looking for somebody who is secular, who is going to write a secular constitution that is not going to give privileges to one religion over the other, and that is going to embrace the values of citizenship and stuff like that. And also, the committee does not have, according to my knowledge, maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't have any Christians. It doesn't have any women on board. So this is what makes me very skeptical about this committee.
Okay, let's go to Nassim Tarona. He's in Amman, Jordan. Nassim, there have been demonstrations in Jordan, and the government there has responded so far. We've heard just today that they will be lifting some of the restrictions on gatherings, that people can now gather in the country without having to seek permission. What do you make of the response so far by the Jordanians?
I think the Bakhit government coming into power in its first few days has made some relatively interesting moves, sending various making some symbolic acts with regards to public gathering laws, lifting that ban, and amongst other things. However, this is a government that is yet to be tested. I think we still have a long way to go. I think the Jordanians are really demanding much larger steps towards reform, and it's not just about small acts of symbolism, such as the public gathering law. I think it's really time to take that opportunity that's being presented now by Egypt, by Tunisia, to push through some bold reforms in the country. And that is, at the end of the day, what most people here are demanding. They are not demanding the overthrow of a regime. They're demanding for a better life, for dignity, for respect,
right,
for representation, for transparency. So these are the issues that are being tackled by the people.
Yeah, and when you talk about those demands, do they extend to getting rid of the monarchy in Jordan?
I don't think so. I've yet to hear any significant demands along that regard, and I think this stems largely from this sort of perception that the Arab world is one group and what one country wants, therefore another country will also want. I think people here are looking more again towards what's happening regionally as an opportunity to push for reforms, but not necessarily to change the leadership. I think the leadership does have legitimacy amongst the people. They see the monarchy largely as a part of the country's identity. It's intertwined to some extent. And people are really looking towards reforms for a better life.
Okay, let's go to Nasser Wadadi. Nasser Wadadi, I'm going to give you the last word on the show. We have 30 seconds left, and it's a big question, but how do you think the US has responded so far to what is happening in the Middle East?
The U.S. is struggling, and its thinking is still dominated by old cliches from the 20th century. They need to run an update patch to their policy. But the last thing, actually, I think the most interesting and important point to make here, as a Mauritanian,
right,
someone with a lot of experience with coups, following up on what Wael said in Cairo, is that do not trust the military. The military, at the end of the day,
Nasser,
is loyal to the military.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, are we in a world with an obsolete G20 and another impending economic meltdown? We speak with two economists who warn it may be looming. Make sure to tune in for that. We'll see you next time.